Some of my students are surprised that there needs to be a lecture about how to read comics. Why have a crash course in comics? Doesn't everybody know how to read comics? When I was teaching our course at McEwen on readings and speculative fiction some years ago, I included a few comic books in the course. And when it came time for my English majors to read those comics, they felt that they were at some sort of loss for how to analyze them. And I don't think it was that they couldn't read them for content, although I did have a few students who felt really adrift. They were like, I've never really read comic books, or I haven't read comic books since I was a kid. And I found out from a friend who owned a comic shop for many years, still owns a comic shop, and he said he would see that in people who would read comics as kids, and then they wouldn't read comics at all, say in between the age of 7 or 8, up until they were an adult, and then they come back to this and they found themselves lacking perhaps the intuition that a child has for picture books. But my English students struggled with how to read a comic perhaps closely. How do we read a comic for analysis? What is the grammar of a comic? What is the syntax of a comic book? They knew how to take prose fiction and analyze it. And I've had this same problem with students coming into film classes if they haven't had any exposure to what the grammar of film is. What is film language? And just like film has its own features that are endemic to that work, they're particular to cinema. Comics have certain things that I would never want to say that only comics can tell that story, but I'd say it this way: only comics can tell that story this way. Okay, so people notice that there are similarities between film and comics, but they're not quite the same thing. There are things that cinema can do that comic books can't. Comic books cannot do jump scares, but comic books can render moments of intense combat over a 2-page spread and allow the eye to just wander around the page, taking in the text and taking in the image and absorbing it. Cinema tries to do that. If we've ever seen the opening sequence to Deadpool, or there's a moment in one of the Avengers films when everything sort of slows down in this wonderful tableau, but the movie still has to keep going. Whereas if I want, I can spend as much time admiring a page of comics art as I want, and that's one of the, I think, really important differences between comics and film. And in that way, comics are a little like prose books in that our eye does wander around the page. The difference is that, we will mostly only go back in prose if it's particularly beautiful, or if we feel like we've missed something, at which point we have to think, somebody screwed up. Whereas in comics, we might go back just to admire, and that, to see the beauty again, beauty of prose, or the beauty of a great piece of art. But our eye is moving all over the page, and that creates a very different experience. I think it creates a very different experience than the other modes that I'm speaking about there. Now, to give this crash course, I'm going to use some steampunk comics, and we're looking at 2 this semester in my course. We're looking at the absolutely amazing series Bitter Root, which has been created by a all-black creative team. The artists, the writers, everyone who works on this, black artists, black writers, black creators. And it's a fabulous bit of steampunk set in the jazz era. I'm not going to be talking about that a bunch today because that's going to be happening further in to the semester. But we're going to take a look at Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda's Monstress. Both of these from Image Comics. So Image Comics has the corner, as far as I'm concerned, on really great steampunk comics. Although I suppose there are people who would argue that neither of them are steampunk, because one is jazz era and the other is Art Deco, and that neither of those things are Victorian and therefore not steampunk. It's steampunk. And I'm going to be using Scott McCloud's lovely Understanding the Invisible Art of Comics, or Understanding Comics, the Invisible Art, as a way of understanding for this crash course. I realize that there are people who, do comic studies who would say that McCloud's approach is not the end all be all. My pushback would be it is when you only have a single lecture to get people situated. If we want to do this fast, we want to use McCloud. There are other people we could use, but their content is more dense. Let's just start off by understanding what a comic book is, because when I say comic books, and then students they'll say graphic novels right away. So I'll be like, has anybody ever read some comic books? And student will say, oh, I've read some graphic novels, and they sort of say it like they don't read comics, they read graphic novels. And news for you read comics. Whether you call it a graphic novel or not, or whether you're actually reading a bona fide graphic novel, if you read something in the comics medium, this mixture of art and text, you are reading comics. And the only reason you would say you're not is because you're pretentious or you're embarrassed, and you don't need embarrassment. You don't need to be embarrassed. The French read comics as adults, no problem. And the French produce comics that are meant just for adults. And I don't just mean like naughty comics, but comics that are written about mature subject matter in a way that appeals to people who are older than 18 years old, or who want something that's more like, the great literary novel. There are French comics that are like that. Likewise, Japan. Tons of comics. We call them manga, right? That's the Japanese word for it. And manga, the content of manga varied, right? If somebody says, I don't read manga because I don't like robots and I don't like, Sailor Moon, and there's so much more to manga than that. And it's true of comics in North America too, but we still have this stigma. We still have this stigma that comics are for kids, that comics are low art, that comics aren't worth our time. I think that's all crap. But let's understand that comic books and graphic novels use the same medium to tell their stories, to produce their narratives. What's the difference? Well, a comic book is a series, a periodic series produced in the comics medium, and the stories in a comic book are released episodically and can continue indefinitely, kind of like a TV show. So anybody who's like, I don't read comics because, do you watch TV shows? Same diff. It's just it's a slightly different medium. So get over yourself. But an example of that from steampunk circles would be Joe Benitez's Lady Mechanica, the absolutely lovely, beautiful art of Joe Benitez. Not a great comic book in my estimation, but great art, awesome art, Mr. Benitez. Absolutely love it. The storytelling leaves something to be desired occasionally. And that's a comic book, because that's like issue 1, issue 2, issue 3, issue 4, and that could go on indefinitely. It hasn't. But it could. And then you get Granville by Brian Talbot, and that's an example of what we can definitely say is a graphic novel. If we want to differentiate comic books from graphic novels, say that a graphic novel refers to a standalone, long-form narrative produced in the comics medium. So, that's a standalone thing, long-form narrative. It might be 2 or 3 volumes, but it's not going on forever. They're gonna release this many issues. The story's gonna end. It's gonna be over. Done. So somebody picks up a collected version of comic books. That's still not really a graphic novel by that definition. And we also have the comic strip. And here I have one from Hark a Vagrant, which is a comic strip. It's an online comic strip. We'll talk about web comics in just a second, but it's a good example of a comic that occasionally includes steampunk content. Wonder Mark is another great example of a steampunk comic strip, or steampunk adjacent at the very least. Comic strip is a periodic series produced in the comics medium. The stories in a comic strip are released episodically and can continue indefinitely. So they're like a comic book, but shorter. right? And that difference changes the way the story is told. If you've ever read a collection of comic strips, it's very different from reading a comic book, in that, you know, if you read a collection of, say, Calvin and Hobbes, you hit the joke at the end of every strip, whereas a joke might be developed over the course of, you know, an entire section, an entire vignette of an Archie comic. This particular strip has Jules Verne and H.G. Wells hanging out, and Jules Verne has an airship in his hand, and he lobs it up in the air, and he goes, "Airship!" And Wells comes along, and he says, "Oh, that's nice, Jules. You sing so, Wells. It's pretty complicated, though, really. I don't know why I'm doing a German accent for a Frenchman. I'll get it down. Just give me a second. But if you are interested, I could show you the blueprints. Check out mine. Hey, how did you build that?" So now Wells has an airship too, and he lobs it up in the air. And Wells says, "I just made it up." And this is a play off of the idea that Jules Verne was rigorous about the science in his fiction, and Verne was like, "Science, who cares about science? Let's just get on to the story." So Verne says, "You can't just make things up." "Why not? Mine works just as well as yours. And blueprints are boring." And we see Wells's airship getting up behind Verne's, and it's going chick, 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 chick. And then boom, boom, and it blows Verne's up. And Verne's, "My dirigible." "Oh no, I'm sorry. It was trying to make social metaphors," he says. This is a very inside joke. You have to know that a lot of Wells's science fiction was always about something else, like War of the Worlds, Martian Invasion. It was really about slapping British imperialist colonialism in the face. That The Island of Dr. Moreau was about, you know, the way in which humans act in bestial ways. And so there's always this social metaphor. Truthfully, there were a number of social metaphors in Verne's work as well, though Verne absolutely was more interested in the science of things. Anyway, we have a comic strip, right? And then we have a web comic. And web comics, and they're distinct from comic strips, because the goal of some web comics can be like a comic book, in that they mean to tell a long form story, but they're going to do it page by page, or, you know, series of panels by series of panels. Here I've got an example from Phil and Kaya Folio's Girl Genius, which has been around since before 2008, because I remember being at Steampowered in California, the first big steampunk convention, and meeting the Folios at their booth where they were selling the early volumes of Girl Genius. So this comic has been going on for a very long time. Started out in black and white, went to full color, and then they started recoloring the very early stuff in a sort of desaturated sepia look. They had this beautiful bright color palette, and then second wave steampunk got bigger and bigger, and I don't know if it was because they were like, that actually looks better, or because they wanted to appeal to the fan base, but they changed the color palette at some point. Anyway, we've got a page from Girl Genius. This is volume 2, page 20, and the Folios published Girl Genius on a page by page basis. You get one page at a time. And so it was episodic in that respect. And a webcomic is a periodic series produced in the comics medium. Stories in a webcomic are released episodically and can continue indefinitely, and really the only thing that sets them apart from these other forms is that it's published on the web. Now, what's interesting is that in recent years, I've seen a move, at least in online comics coming out of Korea and Japan, where it's scrollable, where the format becomes this scroll down, scroll down, scroll down, and it's changing the way that some of the things that we're going to talk about later in the lecture are used. Like, comics have a format when they're on a page, but if you know that your art is never going to end up on a page, how does that change the way you produce it? The Folios were producing web comics with the end goal of print. What if you never thought it was going to get to print? How would that change that format? And it's worth considering these things as we analyze comics one to another. And and we could analyze this particular page of Girl Genius. It's great because the characters are falling, and we get 3 very long rectangular frames, and just this drop. But it isn't just a play-by-play of this object dropping. The middle panel, I said frames earlier, I meant panel. The middle panel of these 3 long rectangular panels, which take a standard comics page and divided it perfectly into 3, is a close-up of the people who are falling inside this steampunk flying machine. And then we get 2 triangles, one in the top right-hand corner, top right-hand corner, and the other in the bottom left-hand corner, where we get extra action and dialogue. There's a ton of dialogue on this page, and it's really cool how well it's spaced out to make sure that we don't lose out on the images. That's an example of a steampunk web comic. I want to come back around to the idea of comic books and graphic novels, because when we have a collected edition like Monstress Volume 1, that's what my students are looking at, Volume 1, Awakening, it is a collection of several issues of the series that had already been coming out for some time. I remember seeing the covers to this, and the people at my comic shop going, "Mike, why aren't you reading Monstress?" And I'm like, "I'm just busy right now. I don't have any time for this. I did steampunk." And I'm like, "I'm not doing steampunk right now," because this was before I was working on my book, and it was after I'd done my PhD, and I just needed a little bit of a steampunk break. But they kept going, "You got to read it. You got to read it." And so I said, "You know what? I'm going to read it when it comes out in the collected edition." Then I did, and I was completely blown away. Initially, just by Sana Takeda's art, but in rereads, more and more, I just so appreciate Marjorie Liu's storytelling as well. So we get a sort of both thing going on when we get these collected editions, especially in a series like Monstress, which isn't like the ongoing series that come from Marvel or DC, where they've been going on for so long that they're no longer creator controlled. There's the person who started this story is not the person who's telling it anymore, because in the case of Superman, it's been nearly 100 years since that series started. Well, it will be in a couple decades, and so obviously it's not Siegel and Schuster anymore. It's whoever's working on it, Gene Luen Yang or somebody like that, taking up the mantle and running with it. But every now and again, in a monthly comic book, they'll just get Joe Artist and Jill Writer to construct an issue, and it's a one-shot. They call them one-shots, or single issue story, and that could end up in a collected edition, a collected volume. But it wouldn't really advance the storyline that was going on in the monthly issues. But Monstress, because Image Comics is largely devoted to comics that they're made by this person and this person. These are the people who are working on it. So it might just be the brainchild of one artist, or an artist and a writer, or just a writer who gets different artists along the way. But at any rate, there is a singularity of vision, of creative vision in those cases, in the cases of comics made by companies like Image. And Image isn't the only one doing it. We've got other comics companies that do the same sort of thing that Image does. But what we get then are comic books that are building towards a massive graphic novel, because it's still Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda who are publishing Monstress to this day. Okay, so we get the periodic series produced in the comics medium, but we're also ultimately getting a lengthy graphic novel. Will Eisner called comics the comics medium. What is comics art? I kept talking about the comics medium. What is the comics medium? It is sequential art. That's the best definition I think that we have. Will Eisner's very succinct, incredibly concise statement, sequential art, which usually combines image with text, though not always. I have comics where there is no text. I don't think we can really have comics without image, though. Although there are certain parts of Dave Sim's Cerebus that looks that way. But the comic overall is going to get back around to having image at some point, even if it, in the case of Dave Sim's Cerebus, takes place in the dark in a couple of scenes, and all you get is speech balloons and text. Usually combines image with text in a meaningful sequence. So this isn't just like random images. These images craft a story. And this is that overlap between cinema and the comics medium. If a movie is storyboarded, storyboards often look like comics. And there are artists who work in comics who work in storyboarding and vice versa, because they're really good at sequential art. And so we can take a look at this page from Monstress, where Micah is speaking to her captor inside the this armored cart, and she reaches out to get a smoke from her captor, and we see that being passed across. There's no actual motion going on, but we perceive through a process called closure how the narrative is spooling out here. So it's sequential art, images in a sequence, and in North America, we read those left to right. And in Japan, you read them in the opposite direction. You read them right to left. So that's the convention of what direction we read a comic is arbitrary. We don't have to read it that way any more than we have to read language that way. So in North America, we read comics in the same direction that we read our language, or the language of English. I shouldn't say our language, because there's lots of languages in North America. And we not only read in that direction, but then we go top down, and that's also true for speech balloons. So you read the topmost speech balloon in a panel first, and then the one that's down from it, or you go left to right. You sort of have to intuitively look and figure out where does that go, and that can sometimes require a little bit of jazzing around, but you work it out. Let's get down to the medium and how the image interacts with the text as well. In McCloud's Understanding Comics, he talks about the universality of cartoon imagery, and he shows a photorealistic image of a face. It might even be just a perfect photograph, and then we see it being reduced in complexity from a sketch that looks an awful lot like the photo, to a face that resembles the photo but not perfectly, to a picture where it's that's the same hairdo, and we can still tell that it's a male or a masculine face, and then finally we just get the circle, 2 eyes, and a line for the mouth with no smiley, but the kind of face that we see in emojis. And he says the more cartoony a face is, the more people it could be said to describe, which is why emojis work as a way of communicating how we feel, because we don't have to be I have to choose an emoji that looks exactly like me, or has hair like me, or skin like me. We just go, okay, I'm going to choose this emoji because it's completely abstract. Nobody's head is perfectly circular, and we don't look that way. And so it creates a sense of universality. But the closer that the image comes to looking like reality, the fewer people it could be said to describe, the less universal it is. And we can take a look at this further through images of Captain Nemo from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in 2 different comics. The first is The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and this rendering here is done by Kevin O'Neill. I would say that it falls more towards the realistic side of things. It's not perfectly realistic, but it's far more realistic than Bruno's Nemo, which is just very thick, straight line art, very exaggerated size of shoulders. The width of the head is super skinny. The length of the head would be monstrous in real life. People would be like, are you an alien? And so that's a more universal, we might say, version of Nemo than Kevin O'Neill's is. So Kevin O'Neill's version has lots of lines, lots of sketch lines. There's more detail, and the proportions are more realistic. The one that Bruno does is exaggerated again, but we can still recognize it as a person. And when we put those side by side, we might also be able to say, yeah, they both appear to be the Captain Nemo that Verne described in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and mostly in The Mysterious Island. So less universal, usually more detail, more realistic. More universal, less detail, less realistic. And he has a number of scales for that. McCloud does in Understanding Comics. He talks about how moving from the left side with the photo to the emoji-looking image is a move from complexity to simplicity, from realism to iconic images, objective to subjective positions, specific to universal. Sana Takeda's art is definitely more complex, less simple, more realistic, not so iconic. So much so that, if you were to just glance through the book, you might be confused on certain pages between the protagonist, Micah Halfwolf, and one of the antagonists, Sophia, at least before she's wounded. So we get it's not as iconic. It's not like when we see Batman or Wonder Woman on a page, there's this immediate sort of like iconic recognition based upon color schemes, but also simplicity of costume. Archie, Betty, Veronica, Jughead all jump out and are immediately recognizable, even though like all you really need to change from Betty to Veronica is like hair color. But those are some simple ways of differentiating characters in comics. Sana Takeda going for something more complex, something more realistic, something more objective. And what do we mean by this? Well, we get a very clear idea of what the artist's vision is for what's going on here, whereas a more simple or iconic approach might be open to greater interpretation depending on the artist's goals. But we get specifics as well. We're not guessing at the type of weapon somebody's holding or the color of their costume or the detail on an axe blade. That's all clear to us. So that's just the simplicity versus complexity of image. How realistic does it look, and how does that affect us as the reader? And then McCloud talks about how closure works in comics, a movement from one panel to another, or the eyes movement anyway. And he says this phenomenon of observing the parts but perceiving the whole has a name. He's been talking about this, like if we only see half of a sign, we should be able to extrapolate what the rest of the sign looks like. If we see, half of somebody's face, we can extrapolate what we think the rest of it looks like. In fact, we've been doing this a ton through COVID. People have a mask up, and they take the mask down, and you go, oh, that's not at all what I thought you'd look like. I didn't know you had a beard. That kind of thing. And we call observing the parts but perceiving the whole closure. Okay? And McCloud talks about the space between the panels. And he says that's what comics aficionados have named the gutter. Okay, and there's a lot to be said about gutters, but we're not going to get into it right now. Just know that sometimes the gutter is manipulated to do something, and it's not like deep meaning. If you take a look at some of the panels in Monstress, you're going to see that people are getting shoved out of their panel, that they break the wall of the panel and they're actually sort of moving through out into the gutter and potentially overlapping into the next panel. What is the artist trying to achieve? There's a sense of dynamism, probably. This is action packed. But here we have these two images side by side with a gutter between, and the gutter is the space of mystery. We don't know what happens in the gutter because it's blank. It's just white, or it's black, or it's whatever color they've decided. So in the first panel that McCloud draws here, he's got this guy with an axe, this face filled with fury. Now you die. And he comes at this other guy who's in the foreground going, no. Gutter. So end of the panel, gutter. Next panel, moon, silhouette of buildings, a night sky over a metropolitan area, a city, and the scream, "Ee-ya!" I had a friend in high school who always used to love to read sound effects in comics literally, right? So he'd be like, "Ee-ya-ah-ah." That's how he'd pronounce that one. So what's happened from the guy with the axe coming at the guy without the axe? We don't know. Not at this point. We would need more images, but we have a pretty decent sense based upon the brain's, ability to do pattern recognition to say, well, dude who was yelling no is probably dead. It's not for sure, but it's likely. So we go from panel to panel and we generate closure. And sometimes we need a lot of closure because there's that big jump from, guy with an axe to cityscape and a scream. But sometimes we need very little. So McCloud talks about a number of different shifts that we see in comics. And he talks about these shifts as panel-to-panel transitions. And he's got a number of categories for them. The first category he calls moment-to-moment. This is one that requires very little closure, moment-to-moment. And we see one of these on the page when Micah Half-Wolf finally gets to Lady Yvette. And Lady Yvette is seen in 3 quick, almost square panels as recognition dawns upon her face. But her image is mostly the same. Like, it's not, Sana Takeda doesn't have, a full body image of Lady Yvette in the first image and then a medium shot, kind of like a little more close up. She's not zooming in. It's a close up of her face, to use cinematic language. It's a close up of her face. And in the first image, she's squinting her eyes and kind of looking at Micah, trying to figure out who she is. And then in the second panel, there's this sense of recognition dawning. And then in the final panel, Micah Half-Wolf. Like, she sees who she is. But this is done visually in a moment-to-moment transition. Series of them. 3 of them, side by side. And those give us that awareness that not only by the text at the end of that series of images, but through the images as well. Great art by Sana Takeda. The human face expressions, difficult to do. I've seen really comics artists who are amazing at drawing action, at drawing figures, who are challenged to represent the nuances of human emotion. Sana Takeda, not one of those people. She can do both. But that's moment to moment. And then we get action to action. So these are action to action transitions featuring, McCloud says, a single subject in distinct action to action progressions. I suppose what he means by single subject is just that it sticks with one event. I don't think he means character, but subject. Like, in this particular case, Micah and Sophia locked in mortal combat with each other. These are definitely action to action progressions. This page is nothing but action, and it's worth noting how the gutter is done at angles, almost like Dutch angle camera work. It's really dynamic, and it lends a sense of excitement to the page in the way that the action is moving. It's not just confined to a very, slotted 9 rectangles, classic. The Watchmen comic was done in that particular breakdown, and you can do a lot with it, but I think it's interesting to see what people have been doing with panels more and more in the last few years. Jason Aaron's run on Thor with female Thor did some really amazing stuff with panel work, but Sana Takeda is plotting out the shape of this page using these panels to generate that action to action. And here we see one of those examples where a character is out of their panel. Micah is out of her panel at the very, very bottom. She's the image is shoving up into the last one. And sometimes that's just done because it looks cool, because they need more room. But ultimately, there may be something to be said about that intrusion into some other panel. And then McCloud talks about subject-to-subject transitions. these are, you move from one perspective to another while you're still staying within a scene or like a location. And it doesn't jump away. It's not what McCloud will call a non-sequitur. And he says that there's a degree of reader involvement that's necessary to render these transitions meaningful. And I think one of the best examples of this in Monstress is when there's this moment with these dogs who might sniff out Micah and the fox child Kippa hiding, and it really looks like things are about to go south, and then the dogs, like they're about to go up into this cart and find them, and then they turn, and at first we don't know why they turn. Something's out there, Samuel, something that ain't sitting on that wagon bench. And the dogs, right? And again, my friend from high school, but that's the fun thing about the onomatopoeia, I guess we'd say, of sound in comics. We get these non-diegetic bits of text, both the speech balloons. Nobody sees those. They don't have speech balloons floating around in their world, and they don't have, the sounds floating around in their world. Those are non-diegetic. Non-diegetic means it's not in the story world. Diegetic means it's in the story world. And then we get this cutaway to Master Wren, the talking cat, saying, "That's right, I used to sex both your mothers and fathers, you worthless mangy." He's basically insulting the dogs from a distance to try to get them to come over and fight with him. He's the distraction. But this is a subject-to-subject moment, because the first panel, dogs and the dog handlers. Second panel, Master Wren's perspective. So we can get those kind of subject-to-subject jumps. And we also get scene-to-scene transitions. And McCloud thinks that deductive reasoning is often required for these. They are, I think, in many ways, like the kind of jumps in time that we get in films that play with flashbacks, flash forwards, dream sequences, and Marjorie Liu and Santa Takeda play with this several times for similar reasons. We get flashbacks to Micah's conversations with her sister, Moriko, and then it will jump back to the action that's currently happening. So we get this conversation on horseback between Micah and Moriko, and then a jump to Micah in prison. They're talking about how dangerous this is going to be in the flashback, and then we see how dangerous it is in the realization. And something else that we should pay attention to is the use of color. How Takeda makes sure that the color of a scene is distinct enough from the next one so that when we turn the page, we get that shift. I also want to say, using this particular example where we've got one page that's almost sepia toned entirely, and then the next page is a little colder because it takes place in a dungeon, more blues and greens, that a really good comic artist will use the page as a gutter. That we get gutters from panel to panel, but the page itself provides the opportunity for the reader to be surprised occasionally. We'll talk about that more in just a second. And then McCloud talks about aspect to aspect, where we might see a bunch of images, or let's say around a crime scene. We don't get any of those really in Monstress, although some of the fight sequences are dynamic enough that they feel a bit like a mix of action to action and aspect to aspect. And then finally, McCloud talks about the non-sequitur, which offers no logical relationship between panels whatsoever. We don't really have any of those. I mean, you might say that the moment with the Professor Cat at the end of every issue would be an example of that, but I just don't think we have non-sequiturs in Monstress. It's too much a linear narrative to have non-sequiturs. Now I want to talk a little bit about how McCloud speaks about the relationship between text and image in the comics medium. And again, I'm gonna highlight that idea that the page can be used as gutter. With this moment where we've got there's two different types of text on the page in this sequence from Monstress. There's this typewritten text, which is an official report of what happened, and then the action as it actually occurred. And what's great about this is that the speech balloons, which are still being done in handwritten font, or a font that looks like it's handwritten, there's a dissonance between these. The report says a thing, and then there's a sort of ironic distance between the action that is occurring. But right at the beginning of the first page of this sequence, there's an explosion. There's an explosion, and it's right at the bottom of the page, and it is at the rightmost corner of the page. It's the very last thing that the eye should go to when looking at this page. And so we wonder, what's created the explosion? What has made the boom? And we turn the page, and we see the entrance of the Inquisitrixes. And I love that so much, because it's like great cinema, that you'd have an explosion, great big flash of light, and then through the light and through the chaos step the Inquisitrixes. What a pathetic mess. It's great comics art. It's absolutely fantastic. But again, we've got that interplay back and forth between what's being said on the page, what's being said in this report, and what, was said in the actual moment. So McCloud talks about a number of different relationships that you can have between the text and the image. I don't want to go through all of those, because I don't think knowing all of those is as important as knowing all of the ways in which we can move from panel to panel, all of those panel to panel transitions, because the majority of the text in Monstress does what he says is his sort of last category for text and image. The most common type of word picture combination in comics is the interdependent, that there is a strong relationship between both text and image, where words and pictures go hand in hand to convey an idea that neither could convey alone. And you might say, well, no, a book could talk about an explosion and then some people coming through. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They just wouldn't do it this way, right? An idea is more than just, how it denotes. It's how it connotes, how it feels, what it evokes in us as a reader or a viewer. And so you get the official report saying the violence committed against the brave members of our order can be described as obscene. And what the image shows us is that the violence committed against the brave members of our order was perpetuated to a large degree by the Inquisitrixes after they showed up to see what Micah did, right? So the report is like, oh yeah, these Arcanics, these monsters, they're the ones who did all this stuff. But it's the Inquisitrixes who do a good deal of the violence, some really, really brutal moments. And there's this ironic distance between what the report is saying and what we are seeing as image. Arcanics have never shown mercy to our kind, says the report. They are abominations who thrive off the anguish and suffering of their victims. Mercy is a concept wholly foreign to their foul intelligences. And that text is in contrast with an image where the Inquisitrixes' lackeys are going around and shooting their own people to sort of quiet things down, to keep things covered up. McCloud says that when pictures carry the weight of clarity in a scene, they free words to explore a wider idea. And I think we see that in this sequence. We see it throughout the entire book, that Sana Takeda's art carries the weight of clarity so often that Marjorie Liu is free to do other things with language. Like in this, to be able to comment on the corruption of this organization that the Inquisitrixes work for, without having to come out and go, oh, by the way, they're corrupt. The image tells us they are. The way they act tells us that they are, and the text really brings that home. McCloud also talks about movement, motion. Comics are fixed images. They don't move. And so how do I tell my reader that movement is occurring? And we've had action lines, or in manga they're also called speed lines, that have been in comics for years. There's these really dynamic lines either going, in this image of McCloud running down a street, lines coming out from behind him. It just means motion is occurring. It doesn't mean he's actually got lines coming out from behind him any more than Micah's race with these jackals, or what are they? They're hyenas. It's not that she's running through a bunch of black lines. Those black lines are implying rapid motion, speed that's moving towards us as the reader. And this is strongly inspired. McCloud actually has a couple panels of this, strongly inspired by manga art. So Japanese comics have had an increasing influence on American comics, but Takeda is a Japanese artist. And so that influence is perhaps even greater, although, she's got this wonderful blend of manga sensibilities and a sort of some American style as well. McCloud also talks about how, though, you don't just use speed lines to do this. If you want to convey speed and you want to make sure that your reader understands all of what happens in the movement, and the movement is particularly complex, then you might want to employ multiple images of the subject. And we have this moment where one of the Inquisitrixes jumps from the top of the stairs and does a couple of cool flips, and she's wielding a sword, and swish, 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 she's cutting her way through these guards, and she jumps, and then it goes to the next panel, and she jumps to the floor, and all the guards are just kind of still there in the way that they were in the last panel, and then they kind of explode into bloody heaps in the third panel. But that first one contains four instances of the Inquisitrix leader. 4 instances. And someone who's not familiar with comics art might look at that and go, am I supposed to be seeing 4? I didn't see 4 different characters, or I saw 3 Inquisitrixes, but now there's 4. Like, there might be that kind of confusion. And for those of you who are longtime comics readers, be like, really? No, come on. Hey, come on. It's hard to learn to ride a bike. And it's hard to teach how to ride a bike, especially after you've been riding one for a long time. These are just some of the things that someone who reads comics their entire life might just look right over. And I'll say this as well. I think that most of the people who read comics a lot read them mostly for story and don't really stop to analyze how the image is doing what it does. They just read for story, and they remember plot points and lore points about, like, well, back in issue 345 of whatever it might be, so and so did such and such. But are they analyzing it as comics, as the comics medium? Probably not. Probably just as narrative. I like to talk about both. We also want to look at color, especially in a book as beautiful as Monstress. And McCloud talks about how improvements in print technology allowed us to do greater and greater things with comics allowed color to take a central role, express a dominant mood, add depth, color conveying so much more than just Batman's costume's gray and blue, the Hulk is green, but conveying a sense of mood, that difference between the flashback and the now. And McCloud's Understanding Comics was written before huge leaps in coloring that came as a result of digital coloring of comics. That was a totally different thing. That was just like over the top, new things that could be done in terms of depth of color. And so when people look at really old comics, they'll be like, oh, they're not very good. And it's like, you have no idea what those people had to go through to just get those effects. We can do all sorts of stuff with digital painting that was, would have been cost prohibitive, print prohibitive, would have been very difficult to bring those, to print in the way that we do today so effortlessly. We almost get a painterly aspect in the way that Sana Takeda renders the colors of Monstress. A lot of sepia tones, though, again. Very, and Steampunk loves its browns, right? So we get a lot of browns and golds. This warm, but a sort of vintage look to everything. And then there's these splashes of color in some of the costumes that just really make the page pop and make those costumes stand out to us. But even more so is the use of magic. Whenever magic or energy, some kind of technology is used, we get vibrant colors. And when those are set against the desaturated color palette of the world of Monstress, they really leap out and cause us to take notice. And so the magic of the Arcanics, or the technology of the other coalition, they jump out because of that contrast. So, you know, color is something that can be used to just, hey, let's color the page and make sure that you know that this color is gray and blue and this one is green and purple. But it can also be used to help us understand the action in deeper ways, and or to focus on a certain aspect of the page, or the absence of color, right? In the sequences when Micah is inside herself talking to the monstrosity within. These completely, like, and we don't want completely desaturated, ghostly images of both, set against the color images of the real world. So we're inside, we've got that dreamlike quality, right? And we can set those things apart. And if we're reading with an analytic eye, we can see that right away. We say, oh, okay, I understand. This is not, she's not really there. She's observing this as though she is ghostly. We want to be able to analyze comics well, though, when we have a comic that's as beautiful as Monstress is. This is an absolutely gorgeous work of comics art. Sana Takeda, I think one of the best artists working in comics today. Fabulous sequential art, every image, painting, absolutely great. And you want to set that against, there's lots of artists working in comics who can draw lovely pictures, but they can't tell a story. Marjorie Liu is a writer who uses prose in some of her other work, but here she is teaming up together with an artist whose pictures are as powerful as Liu's prose. And we want to be able to analyze those in the best way possible. So I hope that this crash course in comics, steampunk comics in particular, Monstress in particular, helps you to read comics more deeply.